Flowers of the Fern by M. Allen Johnson. Chapter 1. Rumors on the road had been far too kind to the isolated town of Dorisham. Riding through the old forest road, down from the east had come a mounted messenger on a weary horse, almost as tired as its rider, but much older. 2 days of wandering between ancient pines on the forest road, so flooded from days of ceaseless, frozen rain that had become cold, muddy rivers, sucking and dragging on the old nag's hooves and no doubt adding grueling hours to an already grueling adventure. The rider, Freowine, pulled his horse to a halt before tossing back his cowl to catch some cold rain on his face in hopes of shocking a little life back into his rackled, sleepless bones. The effect was immediate and regrettable. Taking him by the neck and settling in his lower stomach, he bit back a curse and threw back on the cowl, though he knew by now it did little good. The journey through the forest had been fraught with nightmares and the shrieking, pestering howls of every hellish woodland monster a wet nurse north her silver could dream of. 2 days, plagued by frozen rain and an endless noise, had nearly driven Freowine mad. But as Poriwis beneath him shambled down the road, Freowina knew the forest as only a distant memory. Stretched out before horse and rider was more than a mile of open farmland between the forest and Deershoram. Where once stood islets of wheat and barley, now were only hills of slag and churning black mud, a line of broken homesteads surrounded by collapsed fences. As he rode by, he could see evidence of crops slashed and burned. A house here and there still stood as an empty husk, while others were being slowly washed away in the endless rain. Freowina reined Ewis to a halt outside a house with a small field surrounding it that had been all slashed away. It was as if an invasion had swept through, raiding and plundering and burning, leaving all that remained to rot in the reeking earth. Reeking earth! Freowina could smell it each time Ewis pulled his hooves out the sucking mud. Sulfur, urine, death. It burned away at his nostrils, and he could not imagine what it did to his horse. The wind picked it up and carried it until it came falling back down with the rain, working an infernal tandem. There was a chill in the air, a whisper from the sky which blew down in gusts through the empty window of a broken house. A wooden beam snapped against the wind, and with a groan the whole house buckled and came tumbling down into the growing sea of bubbling black mud. Cold hands gripped the reins and pulled Ewis away, back to the path and task at hand. He knew as the wind blew harder and the rain continued its assault to linger would be a death sentence, and while the beast had only come into his possession within the last week, Freowina felt obliged to keep the shambling old horse alive for a little while longer. Against the black moonless night, the town of Dorisham gradually grew up before Freowina, standing on a series of hills winding around to the northwest. The highest height was topped by a stone fortification that the master of the town called home. Surrounding the city below was an ancient earthen dike, surmounted by a wooden palisade which breached its southern end with a pair of mismatched wooden towers swaying unsteadily over a stone gatehouse. No fires could be seen burning in the gatehouse, and Freowina could see no patrols along the palisade. Freowina pulled his horse before the gate and cried out to hail. There was a long pause, so long that the rider thought he may not have been heard for the raining. But a voice did answer him. "Who goes there?" "Freowina, son of Freylaf." "What's your business?" The voice manifested itself in a kettle helm poking out of the dark window. Rain pelted against it, adding to the cacophony of the night. "I come on behalf of O'Herrick the alderman, the master of your master." The sound of rain pelting against steel faded along with the shape of the guardsman. There was some intrinsic chatter from within the tower, and then a long quiet, which was broken by the groaning gate pulling one door open. A man, the shape from the tower, came stalking out. He was a burly man, even more so in thick layers of goat hide. "The town is closed, sir." "Even to gentlemen of good standing?" Freowina grinned beneath his cowl. "Aye, sir. Be ye thane or merchant, I have my orders." Orders given can be rescinded or overturned. Digging into his pockets, Freowina produced a bit of parchment, which had nearly been ruined by the elements. It was bound by a strip of cloth which had been embroidered with the heraldry of O'Herrick. crossed axes beneath a starburst. Every freeman in the employ of the head borough of Dorisham would know the mark of his master, whether he could read or not. The guardsman took the parchment and examined the binding, then gave it back. "I cannot read, sir," the guard said quietly. "You can see, man. See plainly what will befall you should I return to Eric with word only that I was denied entry to this place." "Sir, my orders," the man sighed. "New orders." Freyawaina waved the rolled parchment in front of the man's face. The guardsman slouched, then withdrew as he mumbled something to himself. He laid a hand on the heavy door of the gate, then resigned himself to the stranger's will. He barked an order for the gate to remain open and stepped aside. "You shall have no trouble finding the house of the head borough, sir." Freyawaina gave a gracious nod, then straightened himself out. He called himself a thane and had to act the part for the men that he knew saw him as nothing more. Mustering as much dignity as he could in ragged riding clothes atop a half-dead horse, he plodded on through the gate and into town. "Almost there, old man," he said, giving Ewis a reassuring pat. The old nag whickered indifferently and carried on. Freyawaina rode past rows of squat buildings of wood with roofs of thatch and windows of dim, glittering candlelight. Here and there, men and women stood in their doorways or beneath canopies, peering through the rain at the hooded stranger and his geriatric steed. Some were deep in their cups, while others were deep in debt, gambling their troubles away at dice on rickety tables. All were utterly miserable. Something in each face spoke of a kind of inner misery not born from mere cold or rain. It was a mire of the mind in them that had dragged all of the town down into a festering pool of sloth and depression. Though obscured by his cowl and the screen of cold rain, Freyawaina tried to read their faces, judge their reactions to him, see if they saw him as a threat or a curiosity or just another traveler, or anything at all. Most regarded him with distrusting scorn, whilst others scarcely regarded him at all. As he took in their disdain, he could not help but be reminded of similar creatures from their youth, peasants and nobles alike. It made him laugh, loudly. Shrill and girlish was the sound, and it startled any within hearing. Their jostled faces only made the rider laugh more, for they could only hear him, not see him. Beneath the heavy cloak and riding clothes was a body slender and lithe like an elm, and a narrow face of porcelain elfin beauty. His eyes were laughing sapphires, bright and carefree when he flashed them. His hair was pale gold and long, and he kept it unbound against the fashions typically kept by thanes. At last, suppressing his laughter, he passed through the square at the center of town. There, buildings huddled together beneath signposts denoting the trade of their occupants. Fowlers and fletchers, smiths and cobblers, masons and weavers, and bakers. Many others were still open and many windows still lit. But many of the larger houses of wealthier freemen were abandoned. Tradesmen had likely been prevented from leaving to keep some form of industry within the walls. But who was there to buy? Without farms, there was no food. Without food, there was no market. Without markets, there was no trade. Freyawaina knew the Dorisham, even if not yet starved, would soon begin to choke. Higher and higher he rode, past the square up the hills of Dorisham, scaling by nightmarish roads and sloughing mud and loose gravel. The paved square had been a welcomed reprieve for the horse, but now Freyawaina had half a mind to walk the rest of the way, but he knew that he had to maintain his dignity for those watching. A thane did not come dragging a horse to the gates of a reeve. The stone walls atop the high hills overlooking the town and the open fields below were younger than earth and dike. There was a crude, simplistic craftsmanship to them. The gatehouse was squat and low, but looked much stronger. Smoke from the burning braziers was visible even in the rain, and Freyawaina did not have to call up to be noticed. "Who goes?" cried a heavy voice. "Freyawaina, son of Freyalaf," the rider said. He swallowed his annoyance at the incoming repetition of much of what he already said. "The gate is shut." "Shut to all?" asked Freyawaina. "To all! Begone! I come on urgent business." "I say, begone! No business for the reeve. None. No petitioners, no godmen, no soothsayers. Begone!" "And what of the business of Eric the alderman?" hollered Freyawaina. disguising his voice in the most masculine way he could. As before, he dug out the parchment from his soaked pockets and lifted it as high as he could. The guards of the inner ward likely knew better the consequences of denying the emissary of their lord's lord better than the simple guardsmen below. A thane was an officer of his lord, no matter what other position he might hold in court, a trusted man given the authority to speak with the voice of his masters if needs be. Freemen of wealth and property were often thanes by virtue of their standing. Others were made so for their loyalty and bravery, but every man knew that a thane on an errand was no small thing to dismiss. It carried consequences, often dire. As he expected, there was a bellow, and the gate creaked open before the rider. Out stepped a guard sporting a thick mustache and a soaked byrnie stretched tight across his bulging gut. He carried a horse-carl, a man entrusted with the life of his master and often richly rewarded. They were not thanes, but all were veteran warriors or would pay the price for falsely claiming themselves house-carls. "Inside, then," the house-carl muttered after mulling over the letter. Freyawaina bowed low in the saddle with feigned appreciation before nudging his horse onward. A narrow path winded around the yard within the stone walls, passing before each building of the inner ward. Barracks, stable, storehouse, and old granary, each seemed tired, shamed in the face of the last piece of majesty left to Dorisham. The Headborough's longhouse was a stave hall 3 levels high, assembled from ornately carved black oak. It stacked upon itself higher and higher, with snarling serpents and reptilian beasts jutting from the ridges of each intersection. The front porch was bedrocked by a row of black pillars, covered in animal scenes of prowling bears and laughing wolves. The doors were aged to ebony, and upon each door was another animal motif, bear on the left, wolf on the right. Unlike the plain creatures on the pillars, these snarled and waved their claws at each other from across the center stile, which was a mighty oak tree. The house-carl bid Freyawaina dismount, and handed the reins of the old Ewis off to the hustling guardsmen who had come rushing from the gatehouse after them. The horse was led off to the stable, which Freyawaina prayed would live up to the earlier promises. The house-carl ordered Freyawaina to stand where he had dismounted, freezing and up his ankle in the mud of the yard. He stomped off to the front door and threw it open. A cloud of warm light billowed out in the night. Soon, a shadow cast itself over Freyawaina, tall and lanky. The hefty guard brushed past the shadow and bid Freyawaina come forward. The rider dragged himself through the mud and came with some difficulty to the front porch of the Reeves. "I am Himmel," the lanky man said, his voice thin as a razor. His head bobbed as he spoke. "I am steward to my lord Theodric and door warden of the house. What has brought you here so brazenly?" The steward's tone was so insolent for Freyawaina's liking. Some part of the younger man wanted him to remind the steward of his place, but the lingering promise of warmth just beyond the doorway compelled Freyawaina to charm and eloquence. He bowed lowly and graciously, letting some of his golden hair tumble out from under his hood. "Freyawaina, son of Freylaf, I have come as emissary on behalf of Erowic the Alderman, on a most urgent errand." "There is nothing here for Erowic, we regret to say. There is nothing here for anyone." "We shall see," Freyawaina grinned. "I have come a long and unpleasant way, steward, and heard much." "Much?" asked the steward. "Much that would best be discussed where voices do not chatter and ears do not struggle." Himmel the steward nodded sharply. He stepped aside and gestured for Freyawaina to enter. The burly house-carl huffed and stomped away from the front porch and back to the gatehouse. A profound euphoria overcame Freyawaina as he followed the tall steward into the hall. The old steward's head was balding and covered in liver spots. His nose was arched high and hooked, and his face bore a permanent scowl. He wiped the rain from his head and flicked it aside, though it did not appear to affect him. "You are not cold, steward?" Freyawaina asked. The steward turned, grim and serious. "No," was all he answered. The immensity of the great hall was matched only by its cold and empty indifference. The walls were bare, dotted only with sconces and hooks and racks where once hung the honor and dignity of generations of Hedboroughs. 4 tables marked the floor surrounding a burning hearth in sight of the long table sitting raised upon the stone dais at the rear of the hall. At one such table were a group of glaring housecarls sipping on horns of ale. 2 had knots in their hair. All had thick mustaches, and all were cold. The whole longhouse was cold. The fire roared, and gave no heat. Shadows danced high on the empty walls, and the housecarls wrapped themselves tighter in their thick cloaks. Freyawaina felt his heart sink to be in such a place after such a long and cold journey. "Your sword, sir," the steward said. Freyawaina turned, and the eyes of the seated housecarls followed his every move. Each man had a dagger stuffed in his belt. "My what?" Freyawaina feigned. "Do not jest with me, sir." The steward was deathly serious. Freyawaina drew back his cloak and unbuckled the scabbard from his belt. The handle of the sword was brazen, cast in the likeness of a roaring dragon with ruby eyes. The steward knew it instantly as an instrument of great personal value from the gingerly way its owner handled it. The housecarls knew it instantly as an article of great material value, and Freyawaina studied each man's face keenly as he handed it to the steward. "It is precious to me," he said, still eyeing the housecarls. "It shall hang up by the door in honor until you depart. My lord has given orders that none are to carry weapons in this hall save his own bondsmen." "That is his right." Freyawaina bowed, and at last surrendered his blade. Himmel hung it on the rack by the door, and seemed to gather himself together before turning back. His face was twisted up even more than it had been. "Why have you come here, Freyawaina, son of Freyalaf?" he asked. "Why? I am a simple thane in service to the mightier man. I do as I am bid. As do you. And you have a message for my master, then?" "Yes. I know the hour is late, but it is urgent that I speak with him." "Might I know the agenda?" Himmel said, bobbing his head as he spoke. A coy grin stretched itself across the handsomeness of Freyawaina's face. "Curses," he purred. "Curses," snapped the steward. "What would you know of curses?" "Only what voices on the road have said, and what I have seen. But I would speak to the master of the house on the matter." Himmel reeled back aghast. His jowls quivered as he choked back some terrible insult and remembered who he was. "My master is weary," Himmel hissed. "As am I. It would make me most happy to have this affair settled quickly." "You may have longer to wait than you think." The steward moved before Freyawaina could respond. He watched the lanky stork bob off to the rear of the hall. Curiously, he turned before making his exit and took the stranger standing by the fire. Freyawaina watched as he shook his head and departed. The stranger was alone in the hall under the piercing gaze of the 4 watchdogs, all eager to see him go by one method or another. But the young emissary did not balk, nor stir himself to manly displays in an effort to gain their confidence. He glided across the floor to where they sat and bowed. "Good evening, gentlemen. I await the presence of your master, but I am quite tired and bedecked by soggy clothes. Do you mind if I warm myself by the fire?" "Do as you will," grunted one man. "It'll profit you little," grunted another. Freyawaina smiled and nodded and plopped himself down on the table nearest the 4 men and promptly began undressing himself. Fire cowl, then cloak, and soon he was down to his breeches and boots. He could see the curiosity in their eyes, turned to disappointment when his tunic came off and revealed that he was indeed male. His voice and looks had cast that fact into doubt in the tired and half-drunken eyes of the housecarls. They arose from their seats, angry at first and disgusted at last before leaving. Perhaps they were expecting something else? Freyawaina grinned to himself when he was alone. He held back howls of laughter, knowing that it would not be polite. He sat for a time, feeling his skin dry. The dampness was chased from his clothes, but not the cold. Sitting mere feet away from the fire, and his teeth were chattering. He laid his cloak on the floor over the rushes and kicked up his feet. His relaxation was broken, however, by a loud and rather rude cough. "My lord will see you now," the stern voice said. The Hedborough was a massive man. His head was balding like a steward. though he still possessed a long mane and fiery copper hair with a thick beard to match. His face was long and square, with an iron jaw and a pair of sunken sad eyes. He was wrapped in heavy furs, but walking barefoot. Freyawaina quickly rose, forgetting his near nakedness, and bowed low before the head barrow. Hemel announced him. "My lord Theodric, head barrow of the free men of Dorisham, master of the hall, I present Freyawaina, son of Freylaf, my lord, here on behalf of Alderman Oroic." "So, he sends little girls to my hall, does he? A little girl to nag me. Get this girl something to cover her shame with and a drink." "Yes, my lord." Hemel shrank away to fulfill his master's demands. The head barrow turned and made for the dais in his high chair. He eased himself down onto the soft layer of fox furs and waved Freyawaina forward. There was a sly grin on the young diplomat's face, despite the hard words of Theodric. Subtle and slender, he wore it on his lips, but in his mind it was wind and wolfish. The journey here had racked him with a variety of fears, torturing him with fell, bestial screams from the woods, and burdening him with old and weary horse. A challenge now had been set that he could answer in words and wit. A challenge Freyawaina had first been issued as a boy, and enjoyed beating again and again, in all its tedious variations thereafter. Men had often drawn the conclusion from his looks that he lacked any manly caliber or wisdom, so he delighted in proving otherwise. "I can assure you, lord, that I am no girl, though I confess to having been called handsome." "By who? Your leash keeper?" "My errand had been more formal in my mind, lord." Slyly he twisted his head. "May I sit? Conversation is tiring, and the road was very long." "If it pleases you," the head barrow grunted, "it shall not make the road back shorter." With a grateful nod, Freyawaina sat himself at the front corner of the table just before the dais. He breathed deep of the fire, which gave no warmth, and felt a chill tickle his spine that made him shudder. He combed slender fingers through tangled logs of wet golden hair. The head barrow was visibly annoyed by the display and mumbled something under his breath. The form of the young man vexed him. Lean and lithe was the figure, and not without a few scars. Soft and inviting was a mocking, handsome face that could be mistaken for a woman's. "I can guess your errand then, son of Freylaf," the head barrow said uncomfortably. "The old sot wants his grain." "Grain? Yes," Freyawaina answered, straightening up. "Grain and silver. 20 good men for the muster and 2 horses, and of course hospitality for the envoy tasked so dearly for this errand." The young man smiled, crooked and cruel, and made the head barrow turn in his seat. "Hospitality for his daughter I can give. Bread and salt, meat and bronze, perhaps a clap on the shoulder too. You'll find none here, Thane. I've not a stalk of wheat or rye or barley in my fields, as you well saw coming here. My bronze and silver were stole to stock my larder and pay for my men. My horses, my horses I ate. Do not press me for my dues. I know them all. It is unwise to remind a lord of his debts, girl. I have nothing for your master." "My master can sup on words if there are no tributes to serve," Freyawaina purred. "He shall want an explanation more than he shall want your silver." "I've had a bellyful of words. Words to godmen and to shaman, words to your master, words on the road, words in my bloody sleep. I've had a bellyful of words from the old codgers and from you." "So many words, and I am yet to have my share," Freyawaina said with an innocent cock of his head. "Spare a few more, my lord?" Theodric's mouth twisted into a hard grimace, eager to shout some curse or derision at the mocking emissary before him, but the words died in his throat. He grumbled low and huffed, sinking lower into his chair in a ball of reclusive misery. "My lord?" Hemel's voice cut in from behind Freyawaina. Over one arm he carried a long shift of blue wool for Freyawaina, and in each hand a pewter mug of ale. Freyawaina took the shift and donned it as the steward set the cup in front of him. The stork then flew to his master's side and supplied him with nourishment. There appeared to be little joy in the exchange. Once he was clothed, Freyawaina raised the mug as per custom and waited for the kind words from his host. "Ale, brown and warm," grumbled Theodric. Eagerly I take it in place of bread and salt, Freyawaina sneered. The headborough was silent as Freyawaina raised the cup to his lips, drank deep, and immediately spat the contents on the floor. The steward was shocked at the display, and his master sullen. "It's turned," cried Freyawaina. "Aye," the headborough responded dryly before raising his own glass and pouring half of it down his throat. "It's turned." Freyawaina sputtered and set the cup aside, the bitter taste flooding his mouth and mixing with the awful stench of sulfur that still lingered in the halls from the poisoned ground outside. "You seem unconcerned," observed Freyawaina. "Why should a man be concerned over a little bitter ale? A man drinks what he can. Unconcerned about your curse. Recent events have made my lord wary of audiences." Hemel broke in. He stepped around the high table and stood firm in the front of the young stranger, but dry clothes and stinging bitterness of the drink offered in good faith had stoked a fire in the young man. Wariness has not robbed him of his tongue or his senses. Silence would little profit him or Durisham now. Your master would do well to explain the dire state of the farmlands outside of this place. No word has reached Erowick in months. No taxes, no tributes of grain. Nothing. How long have the fields been burned? How long has the rain persisted? How long— "Silence!" bellowed the headborough. He shot up from his high chair and cried down again. "Silence!" Stunned, Freyawaina stepped back, lost for words. "Where are the tributes? Where?" snarled the headborough. He stormed from his chair to a corner of the room where a staff lay propped against the wall and a small sack lay beneath. Taking them both in arm, he flung them before Freyawaina. The staff clattered on the stone floor, and Freyawaina saw that it was carved up and down with curious runes unknown to him. The large sack spilled open as it landed, and was found to contain the skull of a horse. There are your damn tributes." Rumor on the road had indeed not done justice to the state of affairs in Dorisham. Though Freyawaina had heard such whispers even in the court of Erowick that a curse lay upon the headborough. It was a curse born of dark magic that had sparked Freyawaina's initial curiosity to take this journey upon himself. It was a curse spoken of by travelers on the road, cowering beneath the hideous and unknown animal noises in the dark pine woods. It was a curse no doubt scrawled in runic form up and down the staff which had been thrown in Freyawaina's feet to mark its potency. The curse had been pronounced with the head of a horse mounted on the staff. It had been found by the men of Dorisham, who despaired in their discovery. Rumor had blossomed into grim reality. Strands of meat still dangled from the neck when first found. But Theodric could not bring himself to discard of head or staff. Stories spoke of great ruin befalling those who lived in active defiance of a curse, especially one justly wrought. Freyawaina could see that in him now. He was tired. Yes, and old, but most prominent of all, he was defeated. Freyawaina could do little more than stare down at the skull and staff, and he knew that his sapphire eyes had stopped laughing. "Satisfied for yourself and your master?" Theodric growled. "Who has done this?" asked Freyawaina. "She has," Theodric hissed, slinking back down to his chair. He slouched hard as the wind of his blister roars left him. "She has done this to me and my son." At the mention of a son, Freyawaina stiffened. An effort was made to collect himself as quickly as possible. He lowered his head in supplication and assumed the more affecting position of a doting thane. Rumor had spoken loudest on the subject of the headborough's son, though the details always differed. "Word on the road spoke much of your son, sir," Freyawaina spoke slowly, "that it may be his doing that brought the curse." "His doing?" Theodric snapped. "No. If there is any evil here, it is her doing. Her, not my boy, not my son. If I... His voice lost all traction, and his threat died before it was given life. Sad eyes listed away as an expression of sorrow painted his face. Such power had been written in the man when he stormed that to see it quell so resolutely was heart-wrenching. He was not such an old man as to be weak and feeble. There was strength written across his flesh in the hardness of his skin and the thickness of his fingers. This man had been a warrior with many deeds good and brave tucked into his belt. But now There was no belt, and the memory tasted as bitter as the mug of ale now raised to his lips. His face twisted as he drank, and Freowaina knew that even the drinks of the hall had gone sour like the earth beneath it. "I am not here to lay blame at the feet of either you or your son," Freowaina said. That was what Eroic had intended, but Freowaina had been busy devising his own agenda ever since he heard mention of curses and fantastical beasts prowling the forests. There was a story here speaking of more than late taxes, and the young man meant to unravel it. "I came seeking an explanation, and I found it." "I found it," the Headborough said, mustering a laugh. "What is it you intend to do with your explanation? Beleaguer an old man with doom hanging over his head? Rub salt in my sores. Go on. If you can find any salt left beneath my roof, I traded it all for a cure to our woes and have seen no end to my misery." He thrust forward old, powerful arms covered in ancient scars across his table. Freowaina turned away, and the Headborough withdrew. Age was a grudging inevitability for a warrior, for it came to all men, irrespective of class or profession. A curse was the warrior's bane, black magic spilled out by cowards too wicked and afraid to be defeated with dignity. Axes could not hew it, nor spears skewer. It did not shirk from battle cries, nor show mercy when dying men pleaded on their bellies against it. A curse would laugh and send the mightiest men down to dusty deaths if there were the lowest, and all his years of prowess and years of glorious triumph would be no match for the cunning of the cruel sorcerer. That was the decoration of Theodric's hall now, his finery that he had sold to find a cure for his ails, but to no avail. A curse, if it could be lifted at all, demanded submission, and the acceptance of blame and pride would compel a man such as Theodric from ever doing that. All that was left was crows like Hemel to circle the grave of Theodric the living dead. "My lord, I should like to apologize," said Freowaina softly. "I accept," the old man responded. "So easily. You look a fool, and you speak as a fool. Why use a grudge against a fool?" "Lord," Himmel broke in, "the hour is late. Things said in haste are ofttimes the hardest to mend. Perhaps if Freowaina Thane would guest with us, we would be able to speak in the morning." Lazily did the eyes of Theodric turn to Freowaina, who met the Sadgrew pools with his own laughing sapphires. Freowaina allowed himself a small smile, but otherwise kept himself subdued. "There is lodging for you, sir. Will you stay as our guest?" "If your master does not object, I would be most gracious for what hospitality he can still provide." The steward awaited the approval of his master, which was granted by a sluggish nod. "Have you any luggage, sir?" Hemel asked. "Some. It is all with my saddle." "I shall have it brought in for you. My master will wish to retire. I shall have you brought what food we can spare. Your journey here was long and tiring, as you say. I shall also have clothes brought in to you more befitting of a man of your rank." "You have my thanks, steward and lord both." He bowed, knowing that his investigation into this matter must continue. Eroic would not accept that a curse was present and simply shrug it into the hands of the gods as Theodric clearly had. The alderman had consented to Freowaina taking this errand with the knowledge that it would be resolved. Curiosity would compel the young man to act as more than a message-bearer between angry old men. Something had to be done to resolve the little standoff, but Freowaina knew not what. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Hemel stalked out, leaving his master to sit and rue and brood for as long as he pleased. As no other servants were awake at this hour, he tasked himself with gathering up the wet clothes of Freowaina, now partially dried at least, from the floor. Coming to the side of the stranger, he opened his mouth to speak. In some other room of the mighty longhouse came a cry like grinding, shrieking death. It echoed and reverberated off the walls and came striking down, crushing and pressing on the dancing tongues of the fire until they had nearly extinguished. Whatever illusion of warmth had come with being dry had left Freowaina, and he had become colder than the stone floor beneath him. Rain howled and laughed outside as the wind cast it down through the vent in the roof. Far beyond the longhouse, the stone walls of the inner ward, beyond Dorisham, and the fields abounding, and the bowels of the pine forest lurking among the primordial roots of the earth, came a roaring answer that Freowaina had heard before in dreams along the dark road. Any facade of bravery or stalwart defiance had left him, and his smooth porcelain face was now pallid and wrecked with fear. At last, a voice broke through the raging symphony of horror. "There," grunted Theodoric solemnly. "Tell that to your alderman, if you can."